Hi, today I want to talk to you all about wokeness and where I think it came from. So, a lot of people don't really understand how all these things came together and how we experience probably the highest and the biggest level of censorship that at least I've experienced in my lifetime between the years of, I would say, 2014 and 2024. Now, what I find to be the most ironic about this is that the main thesis of what I'm going to be talking about is the way that you created the unholy matrimony, the unholy trinity between ideologically captured media, bad faith capitalism, and mentally ill activism. And these things put together all created an apparatus that I want to construct and then deconstruct and talk to you all about how it actually maintained power and how it manifested and projected that power throughout the entire internet. So fundamentally, what I find to be the most ironic about all of this is that the main people that are the biggest social justice warriors, the biggest woke people, the people that care so much about all of these different issues, almost every single one of them hate capitalism. But in an ironic sense, none of their ideology would have ever been tolerated by anybody if capitalism wasn't there that was insulating it from criticism. And I want to talk about why that happened. So we're going to go back, we're going to go way back to 2010 to 2014. It depends on how you want to define it, but that's where I would really start the beginning. So that's whenever you started seeing terms of service on websites. That's whenever you started seeing words that you couldn't say. That's whenever, instead of telling people, if you don't like it, don't look at it, instead of that, you decided to instead tell people, if you don't like it, then nobody can look at it. Why did these things change? What happened? Why was it that a place like Reddit, for example, that was the open bastion of free speech, suddenly changed and then allowed itself to be completely colonized by a small manufactured minority of people and a manufactured consensus of ideas that is really not representative of their user base or really of anybody in real life either? How did this happen? And I'll tell you exactly how it happened. It's actually very simple. It happened because of money. So what happened between 2010 and 2014? You started getting a lot of ads. You started getting a lot of advertisements. You started getting a lot of, ways that these companies and these websites were basically making money. And if you look at this on the stock market for any of these different companies, this is very clearly the growth period of their business. This is whenever they started really making a lot of money, because a lot of people falsely attribute the woke era to something that was happening during COVID, which I think was the fever pitch, but it wasn't the entire disease. The disease actually started between 2010 and 2014, and it was manifested by advertising and then companies wanting to maintain that advertising money in order to maintain the to maintain the advertisements to continue making more money. So what happened is that you had these activists and people that are working inside of media companies, and then the media companies are running smear campaigns. They're talking about how, this website is allowing, racism or dangerous language or X or Y thing. And we're not even talking about the COVID era, by the way. Keep this in mind. This is back in the, Gamergate and even pre-Gamergate era. This is when these things were happening. So what really was going on is that they kept making articles and they kept saying that, like, oh, this website is allowing X, Y, and Z content, and it's horrible that this is happening. Then there was a harassment and a advocacy campaign that pushed the advertisers that were advertising on the website, that was basically egged on by these ideologically captured media apparatuses and individuals too, to put pressure on these companies, because companies, you have to admit, you have to understand, are they're not moral, they're not immoral, they're amoral. If Hitler won World War II, most of these companies would be selling swastikas. And it's important to always remember that. When a company thinks that your social cause or your social opinion is the correct social opinion, the odds are it's because they think they can make money off of you if they tell you that. That's the only reason. Why do you think they all care about Pride? Well, it's because they can sell something with a rainbow on it. So anyway, these companies care about money. And so what happened is that the media apparatus created and manufactured a false consensus that everybody was upset and angry about these types of behaviors, right? Everybody was upset about this. People were super mad. And now these companies have to take action. They have to do something. They have to act. And this is what's happening also, by the way. It happened inside of mainstream media as well. You saw different shows that were, pushing ideologies that were not necessarily what people accepted in terms of, culturally acceptable. And I think that really, if you take a step back, think about the term brand friendly. Think about that term, brand friendly. What does brand friendly almost always mean? That means at least something that is either agnostic to politics or leftist leaning. And I think that really kind of gives away the game, doesn't it? Because fundamentally, every single one of these companies always kowtows to this group of people. Now, why did they do that? Is it because they're the majority? Well, if Donald Trump won the election, it seems like that's not the case. So why actually do they get listened to? It's actually extremely simple. It's because these people are very good at institutional capture, and they've done an incredibly good job at it, whether it's businesses, whether it's HR departments, whether it's media companies, or whether it's other forms of NGOs, or just different media apparatuses that are third party that exist on the internet, or even individuals that are just politically minded that want to advocate for something. And I think that they're very strategic and they're very effective, and they have been. And it took a long time for people to identify this and then begin to develop countermeasures like what we have now. So anyway, all of these people have basically created this entire permission structure around language. And the permission structure around language enabled people to accept that certain things were just simply not allowed to be said. And this manufactured the ideology of being brand friendly. This could not have happened without mainstream big companies enforcing this ideology by the rule of money. If there was no money involved in any of these companies, then none of these companies would have changed. You used to be able to say the N-word on Twitch. You used to be able to say the F-word on Twitch. Do you want to know what changed? Advertisers changed. What do you think the probability is that every single company suddenly grew a conscience and wanted to make all of these different slurs against the rules at, ironically, the same time that they all got a bunch of money for advertising? What do you think the odds of that are? Well, I'd say what the odds are. It's zero. They're doing it for the advertising money. That's always what they were doing it for. So why is it that these companies are listening to these people? Well, this is the two-part thing of identity capture and just basically capture in general. So you have the media companies that have been taken over by these people who want to weaponize the media companies' influence in order to push their ideology. This is relatively obvious. I think that we all know this is what happens. But then the second thing is that people that work inside of the actual companies themselves also have some of these ideologies, and they create an alarmism around not making these people happy. Now, I think that you've started to realize that usually whenever these people are upset, it's not a boycott, it's a goycott. Nobody cares, it doesn't matter, and everybody that's angry and upset about it, there's really no effect that really has. So if you upset these people, you saw this with how many video games where it's like, okay, well, we're gonna own the chuds, and then nobody owns the game. And so that's really not a good way to keep your job, is it? Sure seems that way. Look at Bungie. So anyway, what happens is that people inside of, HR departments and other types of administrative and influential positions at these companies use those positions in order to manufacture alarmism around the manufactured consensus. And I apologize, I'm using these words all the time, but I just want to make sure that I make it completely clear that none of this was organic and none of this was done because people wanted it. Nobody actually wanted any of this. This was forced on people, and it was done so by the unholy matrimony between mentally ill advertisers, there's that too, mentally ill activists and cynical advertisers that are trying to cater to the lowest common denominator of capitalism and failing massively, by the way. You can see that with Bud Light. So anyway, all of this has happened. These companies now are then taking away partnerships, they're taking away advertising, and they're changing the ways that they want their stuff broadcast and their stuff advertised. And that causes these companies to create a culture around basically playing it safe. They don't want to take any risks. They want to make sure that nobody does anything wrong. And they also don't want to attract the negative attention to the media class and to the activist class, because if you attract negative attention from them by not doing what they want, then they manufacture conspiracies. They try to create negative sentiment about you. And then they call you, nowadays, right? How many people are being called a Nazi? It's like, oh yeah, I'm not seeing your point of view. I guess I'm a Nazi now, right? That's the way that the world works. And fundamentally, I think this was very effective. Now, anybody that plays Classic WoW knows that if you cast the crowd control on an opponent too many times, it begins to have what you would call diminishing returns. And I think at this point, it's basically just on the immunity stage. But for many, many years, this was an effective way of shutting down conversation. Sexist, racist, misogynist, like Nazi, far right, etc. All of these terms were used as buzzwords in order to allow that media class to pressure the advertising and the business class, to pressure the social media class, to pressure everybody else to adhere to their ideology and their language. And that's exactly how it happened. And I think that let's talk about, and obviously this just kind of got worse and worse and worse and worse. And the reason why it got worse and worse and worse is actually something that's very much a parallel of what's happening with the Democratic Party right now. The Democratic Party is going through what I would say is basically a civil war. This is kind of similar to the Tea Party happening in like the late 2000s and maybe the early 2010s in the Republican Party, but I would view this to be slightly different because it's much more existential. You had people that were not really involved in any of these things because they cared about them. They were involved in these things because it made them feel good. And this is something that's becoming more and more obvious, is that many of these companies and many of these people are not really adopting these social causes out of any sort of like real genuine intention or real genuine care. They're adopting social causes as social accessories. They're using their pride flags, their Palestine flags, and their trans flags, or like their coexist bumper stickers. They're not using these as actual pieces of advocacy. They're using them as social accessories so they can signal to other people that they're a good person. So what the point of that is that there actually is no real kind of end goal. There's no ideology, that there's no light at the end of this tunnel. There's no North Star that these people are working towards. And that's the reason why the ideology continues to self-radicalize. It's because it was never about ever doing something and achieving something and meeting a goal. It was manufacturing consent, enforcing that consent and that permission structure on the entire population, and then feeling like a good person for doing it. And that's the most important thing. It's not because of the people. It's not because of the people they're trying to help. It's because the main person they want to help is themselves, and they want to help themselves feel better. And that's the reason why it's become more and more radical. And I think that it was generally tolerable in 2014 to 2019, but COVID really sent it into a, pun intended, a fever pitch, right? And it really got a lot worse. And the reason why I think it got a lot worse is actually very simply because you had everybody staying inside, companies are spending infinitely more money, and I think obviously you had social unrest and everything else. And what happened is that these people just continued to self-radicalize, and because so many people were being involved and basically swept up in the movement, it accelerated the progression of the movement to the point where you couldn't even say that there were two genders anymore. And I think this happened, the reason why it stopped actually wasn't that people got tired of it, it's because one person got tired of it, and that person was Elon Musk. I do think that it was a timeline shift when Elon Musk bought Twitter. I think that if Elon Musk had not bought Twitter, we would probably still be living with the COVID-era censorship, and it would probably be continuing to get worse and worse and worse because those people still controlled all the levers of power. They may be stupid, they may be delusional, they may be selfish, but they are very organized, and they also do have a decent understanding of political theory, and at least institutional capture to the extent that they can apply it and use it to their advantage. And I think that's commendable. I just wish they would do it to something that wasn't destructive. So the point that I'm making is that COVID, I think, accelerated all of it. Elon Musk buying Twitter was like a crack in the dam that unlocked basically everybody's freedom of speech. And you went from not being able to say that there were two genders to only talking about which race is the best race. And that's a really big change. The Overton window didn't shift, the entire building got bulldozed, and you built it somewhere else. So in the entire world, I think this was probably the biggest, or internet world, this was the biggest shift in terms of, ideology, in terms of behavior and everything, is when Elon Musk ended up buying Twitter. So he buys Twitter, everybody can say whatever they want, and then also, at that point, Elon said, well, I don't need advertising, and that's the reason why Twitter, I think, has freedom of speech. The more that these companies allow advertising, the less freedom of speech that they will be allowed. allowed. And you could say that that's fair because companies don't want to deal with this kind of stuff and they want to be amoral. I understand that, but I think that we should also acknowledge that the genesis of all of this censorship is not simply social justice, it's actually just making money. And if it wasn't for capitalism, you'd still have people spamming the N-word all the time. And how do I know that? Well, it's because every single website that isn't run based off of advertising and doesn't, depend on it, like 4chan, Twitter, or Rumble, for example, all of these places have people saying all kinds of crazy things. So the moment that you give people a mask, they'll show you their true face. And I think that's also the reason why they want to use ways to identify people. This is why doxing is so effective. Doxing is also another effective way of doing things, and the reason why doxing is so effective is because doxing allows people to apply those consequences that they would previously apply to companies, to social media websites, which was a lot harder for them to do. Now all they have to do is achieve it with one individual person. And you see this also, the reversal of this with, for example, Charlie Kirk. You see people talking about like, oh, I'm glad Charlie Kirk died, and then they get fired from their job, and these people were saying like, well, this isn't fair, I don't agree with this. Well, that's too bad. You shouldn't have been doing it for the last 10 years. So really what I think has happened is that now you have an environment where freedom of speech is more or less completely tolerated. And on top of it being completely tolerated, you have a shifting of the window of what is acceptable thought, the Overton window, that is happening faster and faster and faster. I think there's a force multiplier with this. And fundamentally, I wanted to let everybody understand and help everybody understand how these media companies and these activists are pressuring these companies to pressure other companies, news websites, social media websites, and everything else in between into making it to where you're not able to have freedom of speech. That is the main reason why it's happening. You're not losing your freedom of speech because of activists directly. You're losing it because of advertisers directly and activists indirectly that are working through as a tertiary source, actually, the media apparatus that they have ideologically captured. Whether this is video games journalism, whether it's real journalism, whether it's, well, unfortunately, basically any type of media that's mainstream to begin with. And you're starting to see this receding. And I think it's almost pretty much gone. I think that you're going to need probably 5 more years of cultural institutional change. And in terms of the very ingrained things like education, corporate environment, corporate policy, and let's not even get into the legal system in which these ideologies are codified into law, it will take a while to actually undo all of this, but we're very well on the path to that. And I wanted to show people kind of this cause and effect because I think that a lot of people haven't really necessarily looked at it, and they're facing they're focusing their anger at these, like weird social justice warriors on the internet. And I think that go ahead, be my guest, right? Do whatever you want to do. But those people are not fundamentally the ones that are making this happen. The ones that are fundamentally making it happen are the companies that are putting pressure on the websites, on the businesses, everything in order to fulfill and conform to their ideology. And I do believe this is a situation that's kind of like nuclear weapons, for example. You cannot afford to not play the game. I think that if you want to control and you want to not have institutional capture, you have to engage in institutional capture. There is not a world where this weapon and this tool is not used. There's only a weapon where it's either you using it or it being used against you. And so my advocacy and my ask for everybody is that when you see people that are pushing for this kind of ideology, especially whenever they're doing it through vectors of commercial aspects, like for example advertising, you have to push back 10 times as hard, because if these commercial places realize that these things are losing money, you're going to start seeing all of these people, their entire power structure completely evaporate, because their power structure is actually maintained and enforced by capitalism. And it's not just by capitalism. I'm a big capitalism enjoyer, but I would say it is by bad faith, unintelligent, uninformed capitalism that is being done by the lowest common denominator. And those are the people that you really should be looking at as your enemy. Those are your enemies, because those are the ones that are cutting the checks, that are forcing the ideologies, and they're doing it from the top down. And yes, they're being influenced by the bottom, but it's the top that is making this decision, and it's these people that are fundamentally pulling the levers of power and changing things institutionally and making it to where you don't have a voice. And the reason why I want to make this video is that I think that a lot of times people don't really understand that. They don't see how these things have manifested, and they don't understand, they can't construct and deconstruct how all of this has come together. I've been on the internet for 25 years. I've seen all of this happen myself. I'd be curious to hear what other people's comments are in the, in the comment section. But fundamentally, I think that we really do have to be more outspoken. I think that with video games, the last thing I want to talk about is that with video games, I think that we've done an incredibly great job. You have many of these different companies that are going back to McDonald's. They're going back to being Applebee's servers. And, no shade to any of the people that do those jobs. But fundamentally, they're simply not, much of a creative job as making a video game. And I really think that what you have to have happen is you have to have even more of these points on the graph in order to have companies be able to see that there's a very clear line. And I think that's beginning to happen. If you look at, for example, a lot of the new video games, you see a lot less ideology that's being imposed into these video games. And I think that you're starting to see it with movies as well, especially whenever you have movie after movie that prioritizes identity politics, ideology, or some other form of message over actually appealing to their customers. And the best way that you can show people that that is a bad idea, there are two things. Number one, vote with your wallet. And number two, vote with your voice. Tell people the way that you feel, express yourself, and do it loudly. Because if you do it louder than other people, then people are going to listen to you instead. This isn't a world where you can just abstain. This isn't a world where you can just say, well, I'm just simply not going to do that because I don't agree with that. If you don't do it, they'll do it to you. And that's my real, I want people to understand this. And I understand it might be a cynical pill to swallow. And I get that. I understand that. But I think that it's true. And if you don't think it's true, just wait and see, pay attention, listen, and just look around. And I think that you'll begin to realize that that's really the path forward. So I wanted to explain and talk about that. I hope you guys all watched and enjoyed it. And I'm curious to hear what people's comments are in the comment section below. So thanks all for watching. I'll see you tomorrow. Peace.